On December 15th, 1773, 3 ships sat empty in Boston Harbor, stripped of cargo that would never reach England. The town they faced held fewer than 16,000 souls, smaller than many English market towns. Yet it had just committed what London would call an act of war. By morning, 342 chests of tea lay dissolved in salt water. But the physical Boston that witnessed it has vanished almost completely. Most Americans picture the Tea Party happening in a colonial village of quaint clapboard. But the waterfront that night was an industrial zone of rope walks and shipyards. It reeked of tar and fish, where some of the wealthiest men in North America kept counting houses within sight of the docks. AI Reconstruction now lets us stand on Griffin's Wharf as it actually looked. Not a movie set, but a working port where revolution smelled like hemp and timber. Griffin's Wharf was a T-shaped wooden structure extending roughly 200 feet into Boston Harbor, owned by Thomas Hancock before passing to his nephew John. The wharf sat at the foot of what is now Pearl Street, between modern-day Fort Point Channel and the financial district. That entire area has been reclaimed or rebuilt, buried under 19 feet of landfill and office towers. The wharf was not public property, but privately owned by John Hancock himself, meaning the Tea Party was technically an act of property destruction committed on the estate of one of its own organizers. Records from the Hancock family papers at the Massachusetts Historical Society confirm the ownership, and Bonner's 1769 map of Boston shows the precise location. The single most famous act of American defiance took place on a wooden pier that rotted away within decades. Its exact location, now lost beneath pavement and steel. Picture this. You stand at the wharf's edge on the night of December 16th, and the cold is vicious, with records showing temperatures near freezing. The 3 ships creak against their moorings, their masts black against a sky with no city glow to obscure the stars. Behind you, the town is nearly dark because Boston had no street lighting, and most families were indoors by 8 o'clock. The wharf timbers are slick with ice melt and sea spray, and you can hear the water lapping between the pilings below your feet. The smell of the harbor mixes with tar from the shipyards and salt from the wind cutting across the open water. You are standing on private property, on planks that will be gone before the century ends, watching history gather in the darkness. But the wharf was only the stage. The men who gathered there came from homes that told a different story about who controlled Boston. Old South Meeting House, built in 1729, was the largest assembly space in Boston, capable of holding roughly 5,000 people when packed to capacity. On December 16th, the crowd overflowed the building from morning through early evening, debating whether to allow the tea ships to leave or force a confrontation. Eyewitness accounts, including a letter from John Andrews dated December 18th, describe the scene as unprecedented in the town's history. The building still stands today on Washington Street, making it one of the only physical structures from that night still accessible to visitors. Yet a building that survives is now a museum visited by tourists who walk streets that bear no resemblance to the narrow, muddy lanes that radiated from its doors in 1773. Step inside. It is 6 o'clock that evening, an hour before the decision is made, and the air is thick with body heat and breath. There is no ventilation system, just thousands of people pressed shoulder to shoulder in a space lit by candles and a few oil lamps. The gallery above groans under weight it was never designed to hold, and you can barely see Samuel Adams at the front, but you can hear his voice cutting through the murmur, and you can smell wet wool and smoke and sweat from bodies that have been standing for hours. Outside, it has begun to rain, cold and steady against the windows. Inside, the debate continues, voices rising and falling, until finally Adams speaks the words that end the meeting.
Gentlemen,
Some say the phrase was, "This meeting can do nothing more to save the country," though no transcript survives. When Adams finally gave the signal, the crowd knew where to go next, because the route from Meeting House to Wharf passed through the heart of merchant Boston. King Street was the commercial spine of Boston, running from the old State House directly to Long Wharf, lined with 3- and 4-story brick buildings. These structures housed both businesses and residences, a landscape of wealth built on maritime trade and commerce. The 5 tea consignees, including 2 sons of Governor Thomas Hutchinson, kept offices here, within a few hundred yards of the men who organized their destruction. Bonner's 1769 map shows the density of the street, and correspondence from the Hutchinson family confirms the location of their counting houses. The wealth on display in these buildings came largely from molasses smuggling and rum distillation, making Boston's merchant elite dependent on illegal trade networks. They defended these networks as passionately as any political principle, because their fortunes rested on profitable defiance of British customs law. The men who destroyed the tea to protest British taxation had built their fortunes by evading British taxes for decades. Their counting houses stood as monuments to that defiance long before the Tea Party made it famous. Brick testimony to wealth acquired outside the law. These merchants understood that the ships at Griffin's Wharf represented a threat, not just to abstract liberty, but to the specific business model that kept their houses standing. If Parliament could force compliance on tea, it could enforce compliance on molasses, on rum, on every commodity that passed through their warehouses. The tea was a symbol, but the symbol stood for something concrete, something you could measure in pounds sterling and count in barrels. Eyewitness accounts describe tea leaves washed up along the shoreline from Griffin's Wharf to Dorchester Neck the next morning, mixing with seaweed and debris along the tide line. The wharf itself showed no damage because participants had famously swept the decks and replaced a broken padlock before leaving. But the ships sat conspicuously high in the water, their holds empty, their purpose defeated. Some Bostonians reportedly rowed out at dawn to beat the tea chests with oars, making sure they broke apart and sank rather than being salvaged. This detail appears in participant accounts collected by Thatcher in 1835, suggesting the destruction continued even after the famous midnight action. The most carefully executed act of vandalism in American history left the crime scene tidier than it found it. Yet nothing could hide what had been done, because the harbor itself had become evidence. Imagine approaching the wharf at first light. The water is calm, and you can see dark fragments floating near the pilings, leaves and splinters of wood and shreds of canvas from the chests. The ships are silent, their hatches closed, but their posture in the water tells you they are hollow. A few men stand on the wharf, not speaking, just looking at what they have done and what it will mean. No one has been arrested. No one will be. The evidence is everywhere and nowhere, dissolved and scattered and irretrievable, sinking into the mud beneath the harbor. The Massachusetts Gazette, in its December 23rd edition, mentions attempts to salvage tea, but the harbor had already claimed it. Within 5 months, Parliament would close the harbor entirely, and Griffin's Wharf would become a symbol of something larger than itself. It became a place where the future began by destroying property in the dark, where revolution smelled like salt water and ruined merchandise. Griffin's Wharf lies somewhere beneath the pavement of Atlantic Avenue and the Federal Reserve Bank. Its pilings dissolved into harbor mud that was paved over in the 1830s. The Boston that committed the Tea Party is as lost as any ruin in the desert, not destroyed by war or fire, but swallowed by its own growth. We can reconstruct the wharves and counting houses, but we cannot stand where they stood because the ground itself is gone. If there is another lost place you want me to reconstruct, let me know in the comments.